Does our freedom of speech matter? And if so, how can we best maintain it? That's the topic we're going to be addressing today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. And today I am joined with the esteemed Troy A. Miller, who is president and CEO of the National Religious Broadcasters Association, Convention, and NRB TV. So welcome, Troy. I am delighted to have you here, and I can't wait to dive into this topic with you.
Well, it's great to be with you today. Thank you.
So, Mr. Miller, would you talk about why freedom of speech is important to you and why that is a topic that we all need to be concerned about right now?
Yeah, our founding fathers really understood, we didn't grow up in the same time period they did. They grew up under a monarchy and under kind of a real tyrant. And they understood that freedom of speech, that freedom to share ideas, the freedom to share your conscience, the freedom to share what was on your mind was fundamental to society. And not only fundamental to society, but it was just fundamental to culture in general, to people. And it was certainly fundamental to a free people who wanted to have a self-governing environment. And so that was core to them. And the other thing they understood was that right didn't come from government and it didn't come from a monarchy. That right was given to us by our Creator, by God. These were inalienable rights. Okay, the freedom to pursue the freedom of conscience has long been held by Christian theologians and pastors and belief through the centuries. So if we're going to function as a society, if we're going to function as people, if we take that freedom away, then we cease to function as individuals, and now we just function as some collective, and a collective which is often not one we agree with.
So we're looking at potentially more of a socialist or communist type of society if we're not able to express ourselves freely. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, if you look over history, every society, every totalitarian society that's wanted to have ultimate power, the first two things that they attack are one, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of thought. All of those freedoms are put in together. And then the second, of course, is freedom of religion, freedom of free exercise, because they want you to have hope in nothing but them. They're the central source of all truth, all things, and all hope. And so when those two things are taken away, then you see society really crumbles into this dysphorean kind of environment where nobody flourishes.
So this is not just a danger to one specific group. It's any belief that you might have, any religion you might follow would be squelched if we lost the freedom of speech.
Oh, absolutely. You look at it's really funny in today's society. If you look at over time, when I started back in my young days, back in the 1980s, the left, the progressives were the voice of tolerance. That was a word that was used over and over and over again. But now the left has moved more into, let's say, the mainstream of culture, moved more into the power structures of the institutions. Tolerance is the first thing they have tossed out. They are now the most intolerant groups that really operate today. Their goal is to squelch free speech, to squelch any opposition to what they have. That's the shift that we always see in these, sort of power struggles. And now they're the group that says, hey, you guys really have to either adhere to our ideologies that are going on, or we're just going to silence you altogether.
Now, those who listen to my show know that I am not a conspiracy theorist, and I don't get into doing lots of negative political views. But I do think this is an important issue because people are being deceived by nice sounding words, as you said, with tolerance. That was a nice sounding word. And everyone wanted to be thought of as a tolerant person, obviously. And there are some similar things going on with the limits to freedom of speech that sound very nice, that sound very Christian and sound very good, like eliminating hate speech. Well, no one wants to do hate speech. But what does that really mean? What is the insidious thing that we need to be aware of so that we can flourish and we can take back our pride and our power as people of faith, really, of any belief or mindset? What are some things we need to be aware of about that?
Well, first of all, I think you make a good point. We need to be aware of the language that is being used and how it's being used today. It often comes across, as you said, that sounds very sensible, that sounds very reasonable, but what are the real goals and objectives behind that language? And so people should, we need to get back to a point, we've heard this a lot about critical thinking, but we need to be critical thinkers on both sides of the aisle, not just, as you said, not just on one side. We need to be critical thinking about the messages that are bombarded to us today. And we also need to have a biblical worldview. I run an organization that represents evangelical communicators. And one of the things that we talk about is, how do we look at the lens of the world? What lens are we looking through? And if we're not looking through a lens that's really driven by scripture and driven by God, then it's going to be a lot easier for us to be swayed or brought into these sort of false arguments. We really have to understand what's being said behind the scenes. And you nail it. Hate speech is one of them. And another big one today that we're hearing over and over again is, we have to save our democracy. We must save our democracy. Democracy is only a part of our governance of this country. We're a constitutional republic. Our rights aren't in the sway of the majority of the country. Our rights are instilled in the Constitution. And the First Amendment gives us the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. All of those freedoms come from this document we call the Constitution. They don't come from democracy. Democracy is how we elect officials in this country, but even that is protected so that the majority can't just overrun the minority, and that's why we have the Electoral College. So we have to remember how, first of all, our republic works, and we also have to remember that we look at this through the lens of our Christian worldview. What does the scripture tell us on these issues, and what are the real objectives behind them?
So, how can we speak across the aisle, so to speak, about this in order to make sure everyone knows this isn't just an attack on Christians? Anyone from any belief system will have their ideas up for kind of the Russian roulette of who happens to be in charge and decide whether those are hateful, whether those are not acceptable. And it could be just what that government or that governing judge happens to decide. If they don't agree with your point of view, they can say, they're limiting your freedom of speech. Is that kind of what's on the table right now?
It really is. And if you look at, past cases that have come up before the Supreme Court, certainly as Christians, there's some of those we wouldn't always agree with the way the court has decided, but the court has always taken a very broad view of the freedoms of speech in particular, and the different forms of freedom of speech. Look, I'm a Navy veteran. I serve this country, proudly serve this country, love this country, and just detest seeing our flag burned. But in a sense of freedom of speech, I understand the rights of people to do that. And so we have to understand that as you said, across the aisle, we're not trying to protect this for one group or the other. We're trying to protect this as a society as a whole, so that all of us can have our time in the public square to talk about and to debate these issues. Anytime either side tries to stifle speech, everybody loses in the process.
What are some ways that are happening now that people from liberal groups are trying to limit our freedom of speech?
Well, look, over the last year, I think we've seen the liberal groups, especially in today's, number one medium. We're in a digital society now. The number one way to communicate is digitally. People communicate every day across various social media platforms. They've become just a way of life for us. And we've seen multiple liberal groups who have tried to stifle free speech on there. Everything from political speech to cultural speech on pro-life issues, or to just, speech about racial issues. So all of these various issues, we've seen the left try to control the messaging on these social media platforms. And the other thing I think we've really lost is kind of that fourth leg of government, and that's the independent media. We have some great independent media like you out there, but the mainstream legacy media itself has really lost its independence and has become much more of a megaphone for one side than it really has for the other. And that's a sad state of where we're at in our country today.
In the next section of our conversation, I do want to get into what we can do about it, the solutions that we can and steps we can take in order to protect our freedom of speech. But for now, I would love for you to list how people can learn more about you and about the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, Association, and NRB TV.
Well, our handle on X is at NRBCEO, and so you can follow us on the social media platforms there, and you can follow all the work we do at the National Religious Broadcasters Association on nrb.org. And it keeps you up to date on all of the legislative battles or regulatory battles that we have that center around this issue of free speech.
I hope that all of you listening and watching were educated, informed, equipped, and inspired to do something about protecting your freedoms, including your freedom of speech. And of course, I also hope that you will hit subscribe and come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant.